Imagine this, a quiet night in Enfield, London. The year is 1977. In a modest council house on Green Street, a single mother puts her 4 children to bed. The routine is as ordinary as it gets, the kind of evening every family experiences. The house, though humble, is their sanctuary, a place of safety. Peggy Hodgson, a resilient mother of 4, ensures that her children, Margaret, Janet, Johnny and Billy, are tucked in under warm blankets. The clock on the living room wall ticks steadily, its rhythm marking the end of another day. Outside, the street is quiet. Not a soul stirs. For a moment, peace envelops the house. But then, it begins. It's subtle at first, a faint tapping sound barely perceptible above the hum of the night. Peggy dismisses it as the house settling, the sort of noise that old buildings make. She checks the doors, ensures the windows are latched, and heads to bed, unaware that this seemingly ordinary night is about to descend into chaos. Moments later, the tapping grows louder, a persistent knock, coming from within the walls. Peggy's children sit up in their beds, their young faces pale with unease. Margaret, the eldest, tries to reassure her siblings, but her voice trembles as the sound continues. Tap, 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 louder, closer. Suddenly, the knocking stops. The silence that follows is almost deafening. The children hold their breath, clutching their blankets. Then, without warning, the chest of drawers, the one standing firmly against the wall, begins to move. Slowly, deliberately, it scrapes across the wooden floor, defying every law of logic. Peggy rushes into the room, her heart pounding. She freezes, unable to believe what she's seeing. Her children scream, their voices piercing the night. This was just the beginning. Over the next 18 months, the Hodgson family would become unwilling participants in a haunting so intense, so well documented, that it would forever etch their story into paranormal history. Witnesses included skeptical police officers, seasoned investigators, and journalists who arrived expecting to debunk a hoax but left questioning their own beliefs. Objects moved without explanation, voices emerged from thin air, and an 11-year-old girl, Janet Hodgson, became the central figure in what many would later call the most compelling evidence of poltergeist activity ever recorded. But was it truly a case of supernatural forces? Or could there be another explanation hidden beneath the surface of this terrifying tale? Tonight we delve into the chilling events of the Enfield Poltergeist, a story that blurred the lines between reality and the unexplainable. Welcome to London's most haunted house. To the outside world, the Hodgson family appeared to live an ordinary life. Peggy Hodgson, a single mother, worked tirelessly to provide for her 4 children, Margaret, Janet, Johnny, and Billy. Their home at 284 Green Street was small, but filled with laughter, love, and the occasional sibling squabble. It was a life like many others in Enfield, a life defined by routine, simplicity, and the occasional struggle. But for the Hodgsons, their home was more than just a roof over their heads. It was their sanctuary, a place where Peggy could raise her children in peace, away from the uncertainties of the outside world. At least that's what it was supposed to be. Everything changed one evening in August 1977. It began with a sound, innocuous at first, just a faint knocking. Peggy, exhausted from a long day, barely noticed it. The children, curious but not alarmed, shrugged it off as the wind or a neighbor's activity. But the sound didn't stop. As the night wore on, the knocks became louder, sharper. They seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, even the floors. Peggy searched the house, checking windows and doors, but found nothing out of the ordinary. She tried to reassure her children, but her own unease was growing. Something felt wrong. Later that night, as the family tried to sleep, the unthinkable happened. Janet and Margaret, sharing a bedroom, were startled awake by a loud crash. They sat up to find their chest of drawers, solid, heavy, and seemingly immovable, sliding across the floor. Peggy rushed in, her heart pounding, and tried to push the dresser back against the wall, but it wouldn't budge, as though an unseen force was holding it in place. "Help me!" Peggy shouted to her children, her voice trembling with fear. Together, they managed to push the dresser back, but the moment left them shaken. That night, the Hodgson family realized their home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become something else entirely. News of the strange events at 284 Green Street began to spread. At first, it was confined to whispers among neighbors, an odd tale of furniture moving on its own and strange noises in the night. But soon, the story would capture the attention of the media, skeptics, and paranormal investigators, turning the Hodgson family into reluctant figures at the center of one of the most infamous hauntings in history. The night after the dresser moved, the Hodgson family tried to return to normalcy, but their home had other plans. That same night, as the family huddled together in the living room, the knocks began again, this time louder, more insistent. It was as if the house itself had come alive. Peggy and her children froze, their eyes darting toward the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The knocks seemed to travel, circling them, taunting them, and then, without warning, the lights flickered. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. Peggy clutched her youngest Billy as a sense of dread settled over the room. It wasn't just the sounds. Objects began to move. A chair slid across the floor as if pulled by invisible hands. Toys left on the table tumbled to the ground one by one. Even the family dog, normally unshakable, whimpered and retreated to a corner, its eyes fixed on something the family couldn't see. Desperate and terrified, Peggy called out for help. She ran to her neighbor's house, banging on their door. Vic and Peggy Nottingham, a couple who lived next door, hurried over. At first, they thought the family was overreacting, but as soon as they stepped into the house, they heard it too, those relentless knocks. Vic searched every room, opening cupboards, checking under furniture, even going into the attic. But there was no one there. And yet, the knocks continued. By now, it was clear to everyone that whatever was happening wasn't normal. The Hodgsons and their neighbors were living witnesses to something inexplicable. But what came next would shock even the most skeptical observers. Unable to bear the terror any longer, Peggy called the police. When the officers arrived, they found a family on the brink of collapse, shaken, pale, and desperate for answers. The officers listened patiently as Peggy and her children described the strange occurrences, but their skepticism was clear. After all, how could a house be haunted? But skepticism turned to shock when one of the officers, Constable Carolyn Heaps, witnessed something she would later swear to in a written statement. As she stood in the living room questioning Peggy, a chair moved. Not a subtle shift or a gentle slide. This chair lifted off the floor, hovered for a moment, and then landed several feet away. Constable Heaps and her partner conducted a thorough search of the house. They checked for wires, traps, anything that could explain the event. They found nothing. The officers left the house that night, shaken and without answers. In her report, Constable Heaps wrote, "It was not explainable." The police involvement added an unexpected layer of credibility to the Hodgson family's claims. These were trained professionals, individuals who had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate. Yet even they left the house convinced that something unexplainable was happening within its walls. But this was only the beginning. What the family didn't know was that the events in their home were about to escalate beyond anything they could imagine. The Hodgson family was at their wits' end. Desperate for answers and exhausted from sleepless nights, Peggy Hodgson reached out to the Society for Psychical Research, a respected organization that investigated claims of the supernatural. Maurice Gross, an engineer who had turned to paranormal investigations after a personal tragedy, was the first to respond. Gross arrived at the house with his equipment in hand, tape recorders, cameras, and a notebook for documenting every detail. He was soon joined by Guy Lyon Playfair, a journalist with a keen interest in the unexplained. Together, they were determined to uncover the truth behind the disturbances that had turned this modest home into a house of horrors. Almost immediately, the investigators began witnessing phenomena that defied explanation. A chair moved several inches across the floor while they stood in the room. Loud knocks echoed through the house, originating from walls, ceilings, and even furniture. Toys were thrown by an invisible force, often with a velocity that seemed impossible for a child to mimic. But what truly convinced Gross and Playfair that something extraordinary was happening were the first-hand accounts from witnesses outside the family. Neighbors, visitors, and even a police officer reported seeing objects move on their own. These weren't just the claims of a frightened family, they were corroborated by credible sources. And then there were the voices. 11-year-old Janet Hodgson, the second eldest of the children, became the center of attention. She began speaking in a voice that was disturbingly unnatural. It was deep, rough, and distinctly male, entirely unlike Janet's normal tone. The investigators were shocked. This wasn't ventriloquism. The voice seemed to emanate from deep within Janet's chest, even when her mouth barely moved. They recorded hours of these chilling voices, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. The entity identified itself as Bill Wilkins, a man who claimed to have died in the house. He described in vivid detail the moments leading up to his death, a brain hemorrhage while he sat in his armchair downstairs. Gross and Playfair were initially skeptical. How could a child know such specific details? But their doubts were erased when they confirmed that a man named Bill Wilkins had indeed died in the house under the exact circumstances described by the voice. As news of the haunting spread, journalists and skeptics descended upon Green Street. The family's story became front-page news, with headlines like "The Enfield Poltergeist sparking curiosity and disbelief." Photographs of Janet seemingly levitating off her bed were published, fueling debates about the authenticity of the events. Skeptics argued that the photographs showed nothing more than a girl jumping from her bed. Others claimed that the children were orchestrating elaborate pranks to gain attention. But Gross and Playfair stood by their findings, releasing their recordings and photographs as evidence. The investigators even conducted tests to ensure Janet wasn't faking the voices. They taped her mouth shut, yet the guttural voice continued to speak. Doctors examined her vocal cords and found no evidence that she could produce such sounds naturally. But the media attention only intensified the family's nightmare. Strangers gathered outside their home, shouting accusations and ridicule. For the Hodgson family, this wasn't just a story. It was their reality, one they couldn't escape. Meanwhile, the phenomena grew more violent. Furniture was thrown across rooms, doors slammed shut with no one near them, and Janet was often physically thrown from her bed. The activity reached a level that terrified even the seasoned investigators. Despite the skepticism, one question remained unanswered. If this was all a hoax, why would a family subject themselves to such relentless scrutiny and ridicule? And if it wasn't a hoax, what was the true source of the Enfield Poltergeist? As the nights grew longer and the supernatural activity continued to escalate, Peggy Hodgson, the mother at the center of this storm, found herself overwhelmed by a deep sense of helplessness. Her once peaceful home had turned into a house of horrors, and she could no longer protect her children from what was happening. Peggy wasn't just struggling against unseen forces, she was fighting an invisible enemy that the world refused to believe. The skeptics and the media attention made it worse. Every time she tried to explain what her family was going through, she was met with disbelief and ridicule. No matter how many times she called the police or how many paranormal experts arrived, the terror never seemed to cease. In fact, it only got worse. At the heart of this torment was Janet, the young girl who became the unwilling vessel for something otherworldly. Janet's emotional toll was immense. The haunting didn't just invade her home, it invaded her very being. Her body was tossed and thrown by an invisible force. The voice that spoke from her mouth was foreign, guttural, terrifying, but perhaps the most painful was the way people saw her. As the media frenzy intensified, Janet found herself at the center of a very public struggle to prove she wasn't lying. Her schoolmates taunted her, calling her a freak. Her family was pushed to the brink. No one knew if they were dealing with a true paranormal event or an elaborate hoax. Janet would later reflect on those dark days and say, "I didn't want to be different. I just wanted it to stop." The emotional and physical toll on Janet was severe. At night, when the lights dimmed and the world was silent, she would lie in bed, trembling, dreading what the next moment would bring. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air, felt like a prelude to something worse. Yet, through all this, Janet fought to maintain some semblance of normality. She was a young girl caught in a nightmare beyond her comprehension. The world saw her as a subject of ridicule. Her family saw her as a victim of something they couldn't fight. And even those who believed her, like Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, were helpless in the face of what they were witnessing. Peggy's fear for her children grew with each passing day. She was no longer just a mother protecting her children from the dangers of the outside world. She was fighting an invisible entity that defied all logic and reason. As the months wore on, Peggy's once bright spirit began to show signs of exhaustion. Sleepless nights had drained her. Her energy, once so full of love and care, was now exhausted by the constant struggle to keep her children safe. But what choice did she have? The world didn't believe her, but she had to believe in herself, in her children, and in the hope that one day this nightmare would end. Janet would later tell an interviewer, "I just wanted to be like everyone else. I didn't want to be different, but this wasn't something I could control. It wasn't something anyone could fix." And through it all, she remained strong. She never once gave in to the pressure to admit that the poltergeist was just a hoax. Despite the terrifying events unfolding around her, Janet and her family stood firm, but the emotional scars left by the haunting would last a lifetime. The toll on the Hodgson family was more than just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, and psychological. The constant state of fear, the ridicule, the unanswered questions, and the pressure to explain the unexplainable wore them down. And yet, they endured. Each day became a battle, not just with the supernatural, but with the judgment of a world that couldn't understand the true horrors they faced. After nearly 18 months of unimaginable terror, the poltergeist activity that had plagued the Hodgson family mysteriously ceased. It was as if the invisible force that had tormented them for so long had suddenly and inexplicably vanished. The banging stopped, the chairs no longer moved on their own, and the unsettling whispers that had once filled the air became a distant memory. For the first time in over a year, Peggy, Janet, and the rest of the Hodgson family could sleep without the paralyzing fear of the unknown. But even as the activity subsided, the psychological scars remained. Janet, now a young woman, would later open up about the haunting and its lingering effects. She said, "It stays with you. It's not something you can ever truly forget. It becomes a part of you." The trauma of living through such an extraordinary ordeal left a deep mark on the Hodgson family, one that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Even today, Janet still struggles to come to terms with what happened. Was it real? Or was it all just a product of her own mind, pushed to the edge by the unbearable pressure and stress of a situation beyond her control? Though the physical manifestations of the poltergeist stopped, the question remains: what really happened in the Hodgson home? Was it the work of a malevolent spirit seeking revenge from beyond the grave? Or could it have been a more psychological phenomenon, with the family's immense stress and trauma giving rise to mass hallucinations? And then there's the possibility, however unsettling, that it was all an elaborate hoax, a desperate cry for attention, a product of the family's own troubled lives. Despite the extensive documentation of the events, hundreds of hours of audio recordings, photographs of objects flying through the air, and even the chilling footage of Janet levitating, the skeptics remain unconvinced. Some have argued that the entire thing was a media-driven hoax, with the family cashing in on their newfound fame. Others have pointed to psychological explanations, suggesting that the family may have been suffering from collective delusions brought on by stress, fear, and a desperate need for attention. But the truth remains elusive. What truly happened in that house? Was it truly a case of poltergeist activity, or was it something far more complex? The Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most documented and yet most debated paranormal cases in history. To this day, experts continue to argue, and many people still claim to have seen or heard things that defy all explanation. The questions may never be answered, but the haunting legacy of the Enfield Poltergeist lingers, casting a shadow over both the Hodgson family and the world at large. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Enfield Poltergeist isn't the supernatural activity that occurred, but the questions that remain unanswered. For Peggy, Janet, and the others who lived through it, there will always be that lingering doubt, that nagging feeling that they may never fully understand the true nature of the horror that they endured. If you've been captivated by the mystery of the Enfield Poltergeist, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more chilling tales that will haunt your dreams. Join us as we explore the darkest corners of the supernatural world. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Share your theories, your own paranormal experiences, and your take on this chilling case.